What a privilege to have South Africa's decorated scientist, a physician. He's changed thousands of people's lives. He's trained so many doctors worldwide. He's a second-time guest on the Made to Thrive show. Welcome back, Professor Tim Noakes.
Thanks, Steve. Lovely to be back with you.
Great. Now, I just want to jump in and just see how you're doing in this post crisis that we're in, from last year's lockdown to COVID-19. How are you doing personally? How's your family doing? And how's the work of the Noakes Foundation?
Well, all looking good. Thanks very much. We've had a few touches with the virus, but everyone's come through clean and survived. So that's been good. It's been tough because, I'm not sure that I agree with everything that's going on. And it's difficult to keep your tongue when you have a strong conviction that what's going on is not right. But I've had to, because to say anything would be the end of careers again. I don't want to have to go through what I went through last time.
Yeah, you've been down that fight and you've got one battle to fight, and that's got to do with obviously low carbohydrate, high fat diet and insulin resistance and just training doctors. So I think you've got to pick your battles, and I think too many battles in one career might be a little bit much. So when we do get to the COVID section of the podcast, I respect any no comment that you don't want to say anything. But I do want to talk about insulin resistance, because we're seeing a lot of problems with obesity with the pandemic, and weight loss has become very, very important, obesity being one of the most important comorbidities. How important is insulin resistance? Because so many docs don't check insulin, are fasting insulin. Most of the public and patients I see in my other life and clients that I see, executives, CEO, don't understand insulin. They don't understand what a fasting insulin is, and they don't understand insulin resistance.
Yeah, Steve, you're absolutely right. I mean, we went through medical schools. We never heard the word insulin resistance. And when I wrote the book, The Real Meal Revolution, with my colleagues, and we spoke about insulin resistance, and there we spoke about diabetes as being one of the consequences, and that diabetes is reversible. This was so contrary to the current dogma that I got cancelled as a consequence, and I got attacked by my colleagues and by the profession, and eventually had to remove myself because things got so tough. But the reality is it was all about insulin resistance, and the evidence today is a lot stronger than it was 8 or 10 years ago when I started this. So the evidence is absolutely clear that nutrition is the key determinant of your long-term health, and it acts through insulin resistance. And if, like me, you're profoundly insulin resistant and you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you will become progressively more insulin resistant until the point where you develop type 2 diabetes. And most of the chronic diseases that we talk about are diseases of behavior and nutrition. And that's the key. Then they can't be medicated. You can't medicate a behavior away. You can't medicate if a person's going to continue to eat sugar and high carbohydrates and cereals and grains and vegetable oils. You can't medicate against that. They will get sick. And that's the reality we're in today. I think what frustrates me more than ever is not only is the medical profession not promoting insulin resistance, but they're promoting the idea that only the profession has the answer to long-term good health. And that is clearly wrong, because the model that we have for chronic ill health is that it's a lack of patent drugs, that you're not taking these patented drugs. And that is unfortunately not true. So to summarize, I think if you looked at insulin resistance, it is the key driver of most of the chronic diseases that we're really struggling with. And until we address the food supply and the type of foods that people are eating, we can't address these chronic diseases. And you mentioned COVID. Well, it's clear that visceral obesity is the single biggest risk factor besides age. Age is not a risk factor, it's an event. But visceral obesity, and we lost the opportunity to say, listen, let's reverse the visceral obesity, let's change the food supply, and then we can get rid of this pandemic and future pandemics of a similar nature.
So if it's that important, Prof, I know Apple and the tech out there is starting to measure glucose levels. I've used the continuous glucose monitor with many of my clients. It's been very valuable, but there's some studies that suggest you can be insulin resistant up to levels of 40, 50 with your glucose staying pretty stable. What's happening with measuring insulin? It's such an important key factor. What's happening in the tech industry?
Well, I've seen bits of equipment that were meant to be measuring insulin, but they hadn't quite advanced. So there are people trying to develop insulin measurement, but you're quite right. And I'm a classic example. I had a perfect glucose when I was young, running marathons, very lean, but my insulin was 5 or 6 times normal. And I didn't understand what it meant, and neither did anyone else. You had a high insulin, but you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. So what would you expect? So you're quite right. And I think we need to focus the discussion more on insulin than on glucose. However, I mean, the glucose monitoring is amazing, because if you see you've got all these glucose spikes, you're getting insulin spikes as well. So once you get your glucose under control, you can be fairly sure that your insulin is also going to be under control. But you're quite right. If you just measure glucose, you're not going to pick up everyone who's got quite serious insulin resistance.
Yeah. Now, when I walk and do my shopping and I'm in a grocery store, there's, I think of low carbohydrate, I think of you, low carbohydrate. But the second part of my little acronym is low fat, which is very important. And let me finish, because I think it's really important to understand. And then the third part of my acronym is high fat. So I'm low carbohydrate, low fat, high fat. And here's a typical example. I don't know if you can see this, but this is some nuts over here from a grocery store. And the second part or ingredient is vegetable oils. And we're seeing these industrial seed oils everywhere. And those are the low fat part that I need to be aware of. The canola oils, the sunflower oils. People still think canola oil is healthy. They still think sunflower oil is healthy. They think safflower is healthy. And then you get palm oil and corn oil. Tell us, what are these industrial seed oils doing to insulin resistance?
Well, they're making it worse, and they're making your body inflamed, because they become part of the membranes, particularly of the mitochondria. And then the mitochondria start to leak electrons, and then that causes all sorts of oxidative damage. So they're absolutely not the right fats, because the fats are critical to the quality of your membranes in all your cells. You want the very best fats to make the best membranes. And the seed oils, humans haven't experienced them until 100 years ago or so, probably 150 years ago. Up till then, we'd only eaten animal fats, and we didn't know what industrial fats were. And has been a major problem. And, I'm obviously wrong on many things. And one of the things I might be wrong on is that we've overemphasized the carbohydrates as being toxic. Listen carefully, obviously, because this sounds like I'm refuting everything I've ever said. But what really changed in America over the last 100 years is the increased consumption of vegetable oils. And there has been an increase in carbohydrate consumption, that's true. And there's been an increase in sugar consumption going back to the 1900s. But the oils are the thing that have really, really changed. And for some reason, people like myself haven't promoted that enough. There are a lot of low carb people who are promoting the dangers of vegetable oils, but I haven't been one of them. And I think that's wrong. And now I'm beginning to realize that we really need to take very serious note of the vegetable oils and the damage they cause to your body. Your body can't function normally if you're providing a large proportion of fats are coming from vegetable oils.
Mm. But what is the pathophysiology? I mean, one understands you have carbohydrates, you have these huge glucose spikes, the pancreas has to sort of adjust, send out insulin, make sure that you can drive that glucose into the cells. I mean, what are this linoleic acid? I mean, remember your Minnesota sort of slides you've done. We're going to link to Low Carb Down Under, an incredible presentation, Prof. 3 hours. We're going to put a link to that, 700,000 views. I mean, this stuff is amazing. The trajectory and the narrative that you painted there was phenomenal. This linoleic acid and omega-6s and all these seed oils, what's happening from a pathophysiology point of view there?
Okay, this goes down to the difficult physiology in biochemistry. And again, I'm not the world's authority, but as I understand it, the real complex part of producing energy is in the electron transport chain. And that must be tightly regulated, or else you let these electrons go loose, and that produces oxidative damage. And when you've got a properly functioning mitochondria, that doesn't happen. So you don't get this electron leakage, which then causes oxidative damage. And the thing with the vegetable oils is they don't allow that. They allow that to happen. They don't link as well the transfer of the NAD and the NADH and the protons and the production of ATP is not properly structured, and that causes the oxidative damage. So the mitochondria become dysfunctional. And so that's it should be pretty obvious because the diet is so changed that should be easy to observe. But it's complex because these are mitochondrial changes. And it's easy to measure glucose and insulin in the bloodstream. It's difficult to look what's actually happening in the mitochondria. Yeah. And I think that's the reason. But there are people who talk about the damage to the eye and the retina and macular degeneration, which is directly linked to these vegetable oils. And that's where these membranes are critically important. And if they're damaged, that's what you get. You get damage to the retina, damage to the you get macular degeneration. So I think some of the best work actually shows that macular degeneration, which is the macula is a critical part of the eye, and that becomes damaged in people who are eating too much vegetable oils. So that must tell you that, because you can see that with you, the ophthalmologist can see what's happening to the macula and the mitochondria in the macula, but we can't see what's happening to the mitochondria in the skeletal muscle or the heart. And so that's the problem. But I think the evidence is there, and we've just been ignoring it, and I've been guilty as much as anyone.
Well, I respect you just admitting that, and I think trumpeting now how important it is to get rid of these vegetable oils. I think it's and I don't know what you think about my acronym, but low carbohydrates, low fat, high fat diet, because we need to get these industrial fats. It's sunflower fat, it's canola fat. It's not oils that they painted it so nicely. We need the saturated fat, the high fats. We do not need the sunflower fat, the canola fat, these trans fats. You speak a lot about trans fats as well, and Nina Tachholz, and then speaking about how important and how damaging these trans fats are to our health. So I think it's really important, because my view, having dealt with many clients over the years now, is that when insulin is low and the person is not losing weight, and insulin comes down to 3 to 5, the carbohydrates are low, they're fasting, they're in a good, but they cannot lose the weight. Prof, in your opinion, is it possibly the industrial seed oils that's preventing the weight loss?
That's a great question, because I focus now on that group and thinking about definitely cutting the fat, but focusing more on increasing the protein. And so that's what I've noticed, and following people like Ted Naiman and his work, and then the diet doctor who was one of the people who got me involved early on. And I have a high regard for him. And they started talking that for some people, a higher protein diet is critical for weight loss. And I've noticed that in patients who've chatted to me. And they've said that they really only started to lose, they lost weight on the low carb diet, absolutely. But then they stuck. And then the only way to go further was to reduce their fat and increase their protein, and to look for more foods that are higher in protein and slightly lower in fat. And that's difficult because there aren't too many foods like that. So the natural tendency, as we encourage people to eat more fat, is that eat more protein, is that they also eat more fat as well when they cut the carbs. So I've seen some remarkable responses. And I think that there is another group of people who really only do well on a much higher protein diet than we would normally prescribe.
Right.
So I would agree, cut the vegetable oils. But what to replace them? Replace them with protein. Yeah. Not necessarily with fat, with other healthy fats, I should say.
Great. Healthy fats. Yeah, that's why I've got the little 3-part acronym, which I give to my clients and patients, because I think it's crucially important. I did my own omega-6 to omega-3 ratio test, which has become available now. It's an incredible test that heads off to Norway. But having a look at the type diet that I eat, my ratio was 23:1 of omega-6s to omega-3s, a real big problem. Yeah. Is it more important the omega-3s that gives us the protection, or reducing the omega-6s, Prof?
Yeah, I think it's reducing the omega-6s, because that's what's changed over the last 100 years or so. It's with the increased consumption of omega-6s. Of course, we're eating less omega-3s, but that's been substituted by the omega-6s. So I would say cut the omega-6s, and obviously eat more omega-3s, but focus initially on omega-6s. It's like what we've learned in South Africa is that very few people can afford a perfect diet. And our goal is to let a lot of people eat better. And we can't all afford salmon every day to get the omega-3s up, but we don't have to eat vegetable oils. So that's the kind of trade-off you have. If you can afford omega-3 foods, that's fantastic, and eat lots of them. But if you can't, then get rid of the omega-6s as a first step.
So you agree with the LCLFHF? Is that, can we dub that new acronym?
I like that one.
I want to move on to cardiovascular health. I think your presentation was incredible. There's still this cholesterol sort of hypothesis and myth out there. Tell us the latest research, science. What causes, and the word I use is cause, because I've learned a lot about what cause and what risk factors and what reasons mean, but what causes cardiovascular disease? Okay,
so the real risk factor and the real cause is type 2 diabetes. So how type 2 diabetes acts may be not fully understood, because we've been going down this wrong route for 50 years, looking at cholesterol and trying to explain how cholesterol damages the arteries, when that's probably not the case. Cholesterol may be something that's trying to protect the arteries from further damage. So what I'm very comfortable with to say today is that type 2 diabetes is the cause of arterial disease. And if you have arterial disease, you must be screened in the most complete way to see whether you have prediabetes or frank type 2 diabetes. Most people will have frank type 2 diabetes, but there will be people who go to the doctor and the doctor says, no, you don't have diabetes. Your fasting glucose is 6.4, but they don't check your insulin and they don't check your HbA1c, and therefore they miss the diagnosis. And they don't do a glucose tolerance test with insulin. As you know, that's what you need to do. And so if you're perpetually hyperinsulinemic, that's, in my opinion, is what is driving arterial disease. And I don't plan to be an expert on how that's happening, but the epidemiological evidence is absolutely clear. There's nothing that comes close to type 2 diabetes as the risk factor. And it's funny that I've got a stack of articles that I've collected over the last 10 years since I became interested, all showing hyperinsulinemia, hyperglucose, high glucose, both linked to arterial disease. And they just got completely ignored. And they were always a much stronger risk factor than was any of the cholesterol markers. But because the industry has driven the medical profession to say it is cholesterol, no one took any notice of it. And so it just got avoided. However, the Women's Health Study, that's the important point. The Women's Health Study coming out of Boston, published in JAMA earlier this year, type 2 diabetes. So this population of women was studied for 20 years. And the single clearest risk factor by a proverbial mile was type 2 diabetes, tenfold increased risk. High LDL cholesterol, 1.4 increased risk, 1.4 versus 10. And even smoking was only at a 2 or 3-fold increased risk. So smoking was pathetic as a risk factor. It's clearly a risk factor, it's clearly causal. It is linked, but it's type 2 diabetes that is the real driver. And that paper should put an end to debate.
The question, will it, Prof? Because the whole narrative is still that cholesterol causes cardiovascular disease. And how is that going to change?
Well, it can't change because the medical schools are dependent on pharmaceutical industries for their survival. And so any doctor who comes out and said, when it first happened to me, I was first exposed on the statin story. That's when I said statins don't work and they're treating the wrong thing. That was when my university got angry with me, because clearly the industry had phoned the university and the deans and said, listen, this guy's causing us trouble because our sales of product are going down. You've got to take him out. So that it was first on the statins. And then it was on the cholesterol theory of heart disease. When I started attacking that, then I had to be also sidelined. And again, the control comes directly from industry. And we have to start different medical schools which are not controlled by the pharmaceutical industry. And that's going to take a long time to happen.
So the same as what's happening in this corona coaster where, science is being captured, universities are being captured, big food's being captured, big agriculture is being captured. You're basically saying we need a decentralized system of universities, of education to educate the public out there to ensure that they're not a conflict of interest and they bias with regards to the real science.
Yeah, absolutely. There is no real science anymore when it comes to food and when it comes to cholesterol and insulin and so on, or sorry, cholesterol specifically. There is no real science. It's all fake. And so that's the problem. And just I must just put in a plug for Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, Who is the Real Anthony Fauci? Because Anthony Fauci stands at the center of the whole thing. And it's not just COVID and viral infections, it's also nutrition. And he has distorted the scientific process completely. And who would think that one person can be responsible for the total corruption of medical science? But it's all in the book, and I'm not going to discuss it now. But it's interesting how science has got lost because of what the actions of one man.
So now type 2 diabetes is the greatest risk factor for cardiovascular disease. But are there studies on those that are not type 2 diabetic as a diagnosis, but they've had insulin resistance? Their insulin is high. What does that do to the cardiovascular system?
Well, it's just anticipating what's going to happen if you get type 2 diabetes. I think the problem is that we focused on diabetes as a glucose problem and because we could treat the glucose, we just give insulin and then the glucose disappears and looks so that everything looks great. But of course, the insulin's causing the problem, because if you look at studies where patients are treated with insulin, they don't do very well. The only patients who do really well are the ones who get off their insulin. So that's the reality. So we focused on glucose, but it's not the glucose that's the real problem. The glucose is just a marker. It's the insulin that is driving the problem. And it's driving the arterial disease, it's driving the dementia, and it's driving the cancers. And I think we need to mention those. It's not just all about heart disease. It's also about cancer and dementia. So that's the problem. We've been focusing on the wrong thing. So to answer your question, Dr. Joseph Kraft in the 1970s came up with this Kraft testing where he tested insulin as part of the glucose tolerance test. And he showed that a normal glucose tolerance test for glucose can be abnormal in at least 50% of patients because they have a hyperinsulinemic response and they hypersecrete insulin. And that copes for years, for decades perhaps, and then eventually the insulin resistance is so increased that the blood glucose levels start to rise. And now you can see the patient has diabetes. And he called that diabetes in situ, occult diabetes in situ. And that was hyperinsulinemia. And he recognized that it was the hyperinsulinemia that we had to worry about rather more than the high glucose levels.
So people that are listening now, they need to know their insulin, they need to measure their insulin, they need to regularly check their insulin, they need to do a fasting insulin test. If they're listening, they need to do an oral glucose tolerance test, but ensure that they test insulin. Is that correct, Doc?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you really want to be screened properly, you would do a glucose tolerance test with insulin measurements every 30 minutes for probably 2 or 3 hours. And if you can go 3 hours with the testing and measure glucose and insulin, if you are not insulin resistant, it'll come out on that test because the majority of patients will be found to be insulin resistant with that testing.
Sure.
But and they will then know that this is only going to get worse and they need to start cutting the carbs now, rather than waiting for another 5 or 10 years when the diagnosis becomes obvious.
So, this is something that everybody should be doing. This is what they should be doing and regularly checking, because it's related to all these diseases, like you said, the cancers, the dementias, obviously type 3 diabetes noted as, your neurodegenerative decline diseases. That's crucially important. This is something that should be just part and parcel of every single person's lab data.
Yeah, absolutely. But, we discussed earlier why it's not going to be until we change the education. But, things are changing. The very university and medical school that exposed me and tried to cancel me 10 years ago. So within the last week, they approached some of my colleagues and said, 300 of the 900 beds in our local hospital have people with diabetes. They said, clearly we're not doing it right. Maybe it's time to start doing something. We can't go on like this. And as soon as they ask that question, they're going to have to address it with diet. And once they accept that and see the spectacular results, then it's game over. So ultimately, diabetes is going to swamp the medical services around the world. So people either address that or they don't. And if they do address it, the profession will survive. If they don't, I'm not sure the profession will survive.
Okay, so diet, obviously we've spoken about the low carbohydrate, low fat, high fat sort of diet, which is really, really important. What about exercise, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, in keeping insulin down, which is obviously the fundamental, lab test, knowing insulin is crucial, hyperinsulinemia causing these diseases. Where does diet fit in? Having run 11 comrades, having run 35,000 kilometers in the last 25 years. I love my exercise. Tell us about the sort of the science on exercise and helping high insulin.
Yeah, let's just get the facts straight that you can't outrun a bad diet. And I mean, I'm absolute proof of that. So if you're eating a high carb diet and you're insulin resistant, you can run as many marathons as you like. It's not going to help. And people are suddenly realizing that the majority of athletes who are recreational athletes, if they're eating high carb diets, they're going to be in trouble in due course. They're going to get their diabetes and they're going to get the complications. And then people will say, but I ran all my life. Why didn't it get better? Because they're not being told. They're told incorrectly that if you're an athlete, you need carbohydrates. And I've looked through the literature and I've just submitted a new paper, and it's absolute nonsense. If you are a recreational athlete, which is 90% of all athletes, I'm talking about, there's a small group who perhaps this advice is wrong for, but for the 95% of people, you don't need any carbohydrates. Or you might need a little bit of carbohydrate, but you do much better being fat adapted. And that would spare your health. So the problem is that you've been told to eat lots of carbs, and that spikes your insulin, and the running won't make it different, won't make it better. The way you keep your insulin down is to keep your liver and muscle depleted of glycogen. That's how you keep insulin down. And we did some fabulous studies, which again, I've only realized the relevance of them today, because I was forced to go and look and realize where, again, my knowledge was not so good. We wanted to explain, why do people with low muscle glycogen, why can't they exercise? And the obvious question is because they become hypoglycemic or their muscle glycogen falls. So we infused glucose into these people, and on the knowledge that you can reverse some of the fatigue by reversing the hypoglycemia. But the key finding that we added to the world literature was that when you infuse glucose, you do not stop the muscle burning fat. The muscle continues to burn fat, and the insulin stays low. Here you are infusing glucose, but the insulin stays low. And the answer is because the body is designed to protect the blood glucose. It's not designed to protect muscle glycogen. The moment you start exercising, your muscle is going to use up that glycogen, and you can do what you like. It's not going to change. Apart from walking. If you walk, that might make a difference. But if you continue to exercise at a reasonable intensity, your glycogen use just goes down until it reaches very low levels. Now, why wouldn't the brain say, hold on, this is too dangerous. We must slow you down and we must do other things. And it doesn't. But what it does do is it shoots the insulin down, and that raises your fat oxidation. But the fat oxidation is there to protect the liver from becoming glycogen depleted. So the converse is, if you want to keep your insulin low, keep your glucose low in your liver and in your muscles, which is obviously by eating a low carb diet and exercising. I'm not suggesting my glucose control is infinitely better on the day that I exercise and for 24 hours thereafter than when I don't exercise. And the more exercise I do, and interestingly, it's either you can do two things. You can run for 2 hours, or you can do 20 minutes really high intensity exercise. And they seem to have a similar effect, which I would never have believed. I would never have believed that a few years ago.
All right, so the anaerobic hard exercise for 20 minutes can be as beneficial as 2 hours of aerobic exercise. Yeah,
I think so, for glucose control. I mean, I don't think we've, maybe there is a paper showing that, but from my own personal observations, that's clearly the case. And I think certainly there are studies showing that high intensity exercise gives you benefits that you really have to do a lot of aerobic exercise. And the problem with aerobic exercise it is produce oxidative damage, and that's the problem that you have to balance up.
Now, longevity circles, Gabrielle Lyons talking about muscle-centric medicine. What I've done, obviously with Comrades being cancelled the last 2 years, I spent a lot more time in the gym. I've put about 4 kgs of muscle on, which I'm really happy about. But tell us a little bit about weight training, how important it is to have lean muscle mass, what it does to insulin, because what I've noticed is since I've put on this muscle mass and I've grown in a bit of size, my insulin started dropping even lower and lower. And so what I needed to do is to try and either eat more often. I was doing fasting, eat some good fats, or have a little bit more of good quality carbohydrates, not increase it too much. But how important is the size of your muscles, sarcopenia as you get older, and what does it do to insulin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So firstly, we know sarcopenia is a real problem because it puts you you can predict kind of when you're going to die from as you start losing muscle mass. And I'm now 72 and a half. And so I'm observing people my age, and I'm looking at sarcopenia, and I'm looking at the people who are running the countries. And there's one particularly who's now getting more and more hunched. And that's disaster because that's two things. I think that's vitamin D deficiency plus sarcopenia. But it's really interesting if at my age you haven't sorted this out and get your diet right, you're going one way. So I think that protection against sarcopenia is terribly important, and absolutely you're doing the right things. How that influences glucose, I don't know. Maybe it's having a bigger muscle mass of good quality mitochondria. They can soak up a bit more glucose. And that then maybe makes you less insulin resistant. In my case, I've also put on a lot of muscle, and it didn't really help my glucose tolerance, my insulin resistance, as much as just the daily exercise. I was hoping that I'd get a bigger result, and maybe I have to take a bit of metformin. And I was hoping maybe with weight training I'd get off the metformin. I couldn't. So that tells me that I've quite advanced type 2 diabetes in the sense that I probably damaged my pancreas more than most, and my tissues are more insulin resistant. But it didn't really make much of a difference having more muscle. Mm-hmm. But the beauty is that with the more muscle, I think that I'm going to live longer because of less sarcopenia. And just generally that, what does it tell you? If you've got more muscle, you're doing it right. Whatever you're doing it right. You're doing something with your nutrition and something with your exercise. If you can put on muscle and not lose it, you're doing something right. And so in the long term, that has to be to your benefit. Yeah.
Great. Just last question before we round up. What's happening in the future of sort of AI tech and insulin resistance, and the way you see 10, 15 years, if we have a conversation about what's happened to insulin, what's happened to type 2 diabetes, what's happened to cardiovascular disease. We haven't been fighting that fight. It's still the number one killer in Western countries worldwide. 80% of South Africans over the age of 50 have high blood pressure. That's a significant problem we haven't chatted about, but that's a scary statistic. Where do you see the future going? And in 15 years, what are you hoping for?
So, we talked about new universities which teach different stuff. And what I would like to see is the combination of exercise and nutrition, and that there would be a new group of caretakers who are trained in exercise prescription and in nutrition prescription. And they will be coaching people to get healthy, because medicine is not about health, as you know. Again, when I talk about medicine, I must divide chronic disease from the rest of medicine. The rest of medicine is, by and large, it's brilliant. And if you have a medical problem, you need surgery or whatever, or childbirth, pediatrics, utterly astonishing. The profession is remarkable. And the quality people that you meet are astonishing, and they dedicated their lives and they're doing a fabulous job. My problem is when it's chronic disease, we haven't a clue, and we got it completely wrong. And that's because we sold out to industry and we haven't stood up. So what I would like to see to make a real change is that we divorce the teaching of nutrition and exercise from medicine, and we make it health orientated. And that is when we will really start to change. In our nutrition network, which you were kind enough to mention, we've trained a large number of personal trainers, and the successes they have are astonishing. And some of them are doctors, some are not, some are physical education trainees and and biokineticists, as we call them in this country. And they can make remarkable differences, get people off all their medication. But they have to know about nutrition and they have to know about exercise. And that's what's missing, because at the moment we've siloed exercise into one group and nutrition into another group, but you've got to bring them together, because that's when you really get the results. So you ask what will be in 15 years' time. That's what I'd like to see. Like to see a new profession of real health, which is founded on exercise and nutrition. But that's not all. That's also all the other things that I'm forgetting the name, the group who do holistic medicine.
Yeah,
where it incorporates all those. So that holistic medicine is where they've got it right, but they need support from a group of people who are trained in nutrition and exercise. So that would be my solution.
Yeah,
would be to use those people and to train this new population of experts.
Yeah,
who are coaches. Are the key is that coaching,
health coaching, and Made to Thrive. We've got 8 health coaches online. We believe in health coaching. There's a massive chasm between the practitioner, the physician, and the person, the patient and the client. So I totally agree with you. I think that is the way of the future. Just your last prediction, and probably everybody's thinking about this COVID-19 pandemic. I understand if there's no comment. I interviewed Peter McCullough, the cardiologist, internist, yesterday. Incredible podcast and interview, just showing all the science, the research. He's obviously testified at US Senate and many multiple state senates. But he reckons we've got 3 to 5 years. He reckons even if there are more articles and research that come out about COVID-19, there's a mass psychosis out there with regards to the one solution that's being offered people. Tell us, how long have we got with the pandemic? Where do you see the chronic disease that's going to come from the virus itself and all these possible areas where people are just jumping into?
Well, I think that we're getting close to the end. And I tweeted a few days ago, how do you define the end of a pandemic? And this is what the politicians and the people who are pushing the vaccine have to answer. Is it when everyone, 100% of the world is vaccinated? Or is it when a strain evolves, which is so benign that it's no more than a common cold? As soon as that variant comes along, it's over, it's finished, because that's how pandemics end. Now, they're talking up this new strain as being highly infectious and highly dangerous. But in South Africa, it's proving to be nothing worse than a cold in the majority. And the people are speaking out. There's the head of one of the major hospitals in this country said there's been fear-mongering and we have to change, because he said, in my hospital, we've got plenty of beds. The people who are coming in are not sick, as they have been in the past. He says that he thinks the pandemic is over. So I think that the greatest thing to have happened is this new variant, because they spoke it up. They pushed it up because they had to get the fourth wave in. Yeah. And in South Africa, we were told that the fourth wave starts on December the 2nd at 12 o'clock in the morning. 12:01, I should say. 12:01, the fourth wave starts. Well, of course it did, because they dumped a whole bunch of data to make it look like the variant, that something had happened, and then they found this variant. But it's not proving to be a particularly dangerous variant. And I'm hoping that it's so benign that eventually it will destroy the narrative and people will start to think again. And we'll get rid of the fear-mongering that we've been under for the last 2 years. So I think that we're closer perhaps than Peter thinks. And I mean, I would never conflict with him, because he's one of the giants in this field.
Yeah.
But I think we might be closer. And the beauty of South Africa is that people in this country have had enough, and they didn't get vaccinated in any great numbers. And there's a reason for that. They don't trust government, and they've been under the colonial yoke before. They've seen apartheid, and they're saying, no, we've had that. We're not going to be told what to do. So there is a resistance, and it's not a hesitancy. The politicians say there's vaccine hesitance. It's vaccine resistance. You can wait 1,000 years. These people are not going to change. So
great.
Prof. Noakes, we've got 3 minutes left. Last message of hope to some people listening out there with regards to their health. What do they need to do? How do they need to do it?
Okay, well, I'm the best possible example because I promoted a high carbohydrate diet for 33 years. It gave me type 2 diabetes. I ran all the marathons like you did, Steve, but then it didn't help me. I still got my type 2 diabetes. But the key was I should be dead now. So you're seeing at a person who should be dead, because my dad diagnosed, 10 years later, he was dead from all the complications, all the arterial complications. And at the present, I'm doing okay. I haven't, cross fingers, touch wood, have expressed any of the complications. I can't say I'm not going to get them, but at least I've had 10 years of really good life added to my life. So that's all you can hope for. So just follow the example of all of us who've discovered this thing, that it's not difficult, it's not complex. Just change your diet and your health improves absolutely dramatically. Like you, every day, someone comes up. Yesterday, I was in the shop and a guy walked in and he looked amazing. He said, "Doc, I lost 20 kilos. I followed your diet and everything I had has just gone and I'm feeling fantastic." And he said, if only they could work out that it was this simple. And now I've just been in the garden with a friend who works there, and she'd just been to another part of the country. And the doctor there said, if only people would listen to Dr. Noakes, and all these people started only the Banting diet, all their problems would disappear.
Yeah, it's true. Well, we absolutely declare favor and blessing over you. There's a lot of work that you still need to do. It's such a proud sort of moment knowing that Prof. Tim Noakes is South African. You're known all over the world. All the guests that I've interviewed on the Made to Thrive show, 84 episodes now. We're in the top 2% of all podcasts worldwide. We've got some incredible guests coming on. So thank you so much. I look forward to chatting, hopefully every year, to you. It was last year, it was this year, hopefully next year, and have an incredible end year. When I see someone like you, 72, it's not tickets now. Now you've still got at least another 10 years, another chapter to discover more things and help more people. So thank you for your purpose and your calling, and I wish you all the best. Professor Tim Noakes.
Very kind of you. Thanks, Steve. And the same, the best wishes to you as well, and everything that you are doing.